This meeting is being recorded.
Welcome everybody to the Gateway API meeting for February 27th, 2023. As a reminder, this meeting is governed by the Kubernetes Code of Conduct. Please be nice to one another. We haven't in recent months had an attendees list for the meetings, except now that we're starting to talk about doing meetings at different times, it's actually helpful to kind of know who's attending them. So if you would please put your name and your org on the attendee list, we'd appreciate that so we can kind of see who's going to the meetings. If you have anything else to add to the agenda, it's an open agenda, please do feel free to add something to the doc, which we can link for you if you don't know where it is. Can everybody see the doc? Okay, cool. So I have a couple of just minor reminders that I wanted to get out of the way first, and then we'll go on to the other people's agenda items. First thing, March 6th, and I'm just going to repeat this until, well, I think that's coming up. So is going to be the one meeting that we're going to do a trial run of doing a 9 a.m. Pacific time to try to accommodate Eastern time, European time, Brazil, stuff like that, just as there's been a lot of requests to try to do an earlier in the day or at a different time meeting. So just a heads up, March 6th, it's on the Kubernetes SIG Network calendar, so you should already see it there if you're subscribed to that. Next reminder, and this is a general reminder throughout all of Kubernetes, if you are using container images with the old k8s.gcr.io registry, this registry is being frozen, is being deprecated, and will be gone soon. It is mirrored over to registry.k8s.io. Please switch any usage of images that you have from gcr.io over to the k8s.io registry. Look in your CI and everywhere, like these things can be like, core DNS, that you're using somewhere randomly, stuff like that. Please switch them over. And there's the blog post. You can read more details about that. So with that, Jack and Keith wanted to talk about gateway class plus parameters ref confusion, which I think I was in on this conversation as well. Go ahead.
Yeah, I'll kick things off here. So I'm representing, Microsoft Azure. We're looking into a gateway API implementation for an upcoming service. And in reading documentation and talking with some of the team, then they're here in this meeting to help correct me when I mess up. So yeah, looking at the documentation and everything, it's not immediately clear. The intended interaction between a gateway class and a load balancer and a gateway, and where the custom configuration should live for that. Parameters ref exists on gateway class, which is great, but we're looking for some clarification on some language there. And Mike, there's a Slack thread we were discussing this. Mike linked to that part of the documentation where essentially it says that parameters ref changes should only affect gateway classes that are, should affect instances of gateways that that bind to that gateway class after that change is made. So essentially, implementations would have to snapshot, for lack of a better term, the configuration at any given point in time, and store that somewhere else, and then use and then have different versions of it depending on for spinning up different gateways. The general use case here is, a load balancer. Well, backing up a little bit, the basic unit of a gateway, like in Kubernetes, that you typically see it attached to is an IP address. A gateway is usually a cluster type load balancer or a service type load balancer, and it has a single IP address. Well, when you start talking about cloud providers and those use cases, you might want to have a service in your cloud of some sort. It's a load balancer service that has pre-provisioned IPs or IPs from specific subnets, pre-provisioned load balancers from specific subnets, things of that nature. And then the user can configure properties about that load balancer as a gateway class and create gateway instances based on those user configuration parameters. And it's not immediately clear about how to do that in the spec as it stands today. Jack, Sneha, you want to hop in here to provide any more content?
Yeah, I think that was a great overview, Keith, and thanks for letting us voice this up. Kind of our understanding is the gateway class is really a template of what the customer is going to get, and therefore we treat that as almost an immutable definition, and then the gateway object is going to really define what gets provisioned. As we look at different attributes that can be related to whatever that gateway is that ends up getting provisioned, the question becomes where does the administrator really define the intent that should be driven out of defining the gateway, right? There's going to be multiple attributes that affect how that gateway is deployed or provisioned. And the question is really where do those parameters fit best?
Yeah, I think this is a really good set of questions that I spent a little bit of time scrambling around to try and find where we'd specify, because I know we've had lots of discussions, and it's harder than it seems it should be to find a good recommendation for this. The closest thing that I could find, I linked there as the recommendation in the gateway class spec above the gateway class resource name. It is not in our gateway class documentation that I can find, but it is somewhere, and it is really just that high level idea of gateway classes should be used as templates. That's a recommendation, not a requirement, but the recommendation comes from the idea that we want to limit the blast radius as much as possible, right? So if you change a gateway class, you don't want it to affect every gateway that was provisioned with that class. It could be very problematic, especially if you introduce some kind of error or undesired configuration. This does not, I guess it does briefly say at gateway class or associated parameters. That is my intention as well, or my recommendation as well. We should try to bubble that up to a more visible part of the documentation. But I think absolutely gateway class should be, seen as a template that represents the starting point of the gateway created at that point in time, but it could evolve over time.
I mentioned this in the Slack thread, but I feel like I want to reiterate it here. I feel personally very uncomfortable with the template point in time bit. I know that this is kind of like taken from storage class. I don't think it's necessarily the greatest thing for users, because it creates a state that can't necessarily be known without going through like object revisions, which is like, I don't know about it. Just to throw that out there.
Yeah,
I think we should talk about this more, which is what we're doing. So go on, Bowie.
Yeah, I think this was sort of like a bowing to practical considerations, because all the sort of like end user interactions we've had discussed, they sort of implicitly understand this, or it feels safer to them. So I do know that, from a declarative standpoint, it violates it, but from a expectation and oops, I made a mistake kind of standpoint, it people seem to prefer sort of that behavior.
Go ahead, Nick.
I agree that
Can't hear you.
Exactly that, about blast radius and the riskiness of changing. I 100% agree that it's dirty. And not in a fun way. It really does violate the. Oh, sorry, hang on. Wait. Let me just check and see if I'm. That's why it has. Zoom had decided that it wanted to use the wrong microphone as always. Sorry. So yeah, I agree. This is not great. But the trade-off, the other option here is that if you make a change to gateway class, it must immediately be reconciled out to everything, that all the gateways that are in that gateway class, which makes like changing a gateway class like an absolutely nightmarish change. Like you imagine if you've got 10 gateways provisioned and you change a params ref, and that means that all 10 of those gateways now need to be re-provisioned. Like that's it just makes the blast radius like ridiculously big, and that's why we did it that way. I did want to talk a little bit about. So Rob, did you want to talk more about that part? Because I wanted to talk a little bit about the addresses thing. So if you want to talk about.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, thanks. So I just wanted to maybe agree with what everyone has already said and go kind of maybe we need to work on how we're documenting this a little bit more and describe the idea that really making major changes to a gateway class is not something we expect or recommend. If you have major changes to make, it probably should be a new gateway class. I think changes at that level are just too risky to justify making, propagating them down to every attached gateway. Again, if you have no gateways, it's no big deal. You can make as big changes as you want. But maybe that is the kind of thing that we want to expose as guidance. Again, kind of going back to what Bowie said, this is not really a proper declarative model here, but at the same time, it's just a practical one of trying to keep users as safe as possible and avoid bad situations. That's all. I think I'll hand it back to Nick.
Yeah, so I wanted to talk a little bit about what the existing expectations are around address. I think that may be relevant a bit for John's John's thing as well. So maybe Sneha, did you have something you wanted to say before I get started on that?
Yeah, actually, more on this gateway class and the blast radius. I mean, I do understand that, the implication is you have 10 gateways and it can impact and it's a bigger change. But what if, it's scope to we had it's the platform operator. Similarly, we scope the role of who can modify this. So assuming that the person making this change is consciously aware of the change they're making. And, maybe, yeah, because, the impact can be so wide, we already have the parameter reference in the gateway class and, maybe define a CRD for that, which has its own set of validations. So until that one is not in a valid state, it can't, attach to the gateway class in the sense the gateway class won't take that in. And that way, you can minimize these user errors. Just a suggestion out there. Because again, so again, thinking on the perspectives of cloud providers, what happens is, yes, in the Kubernetes world, when we say like Keith mentioned, right, a gateway is with one, you're basically associated with the IP. But when you come to cloud providers, the IP is just one part, but we have a whole infrastructure out there, right? And we can spin off multiple IPs from that infrastructure. So, we need something at the top level that gives customers the ability to change that infrastructure. Not everyone can change that infrastructure, but if they scope who has access, they can kind of minimize the blast radius impact. But again, it's still in the control of some people.
Good thoughts.
Yeah, I 100% agree that for params ref CRDs, it makes sense to have a validating admission webhook or something like that. John, do you want to go? And then I think the next thing that I want to say is going to lead into your thing anyway. So
yeah, I was just going to say a lot of this is really, really similar to what my GEP is talking about for in-cluster deployments. So it may make sense. I mean, we'll go over that in a minute, but it may make sense to split that one into the common part that is just configuring gateways, and then also the in-cluster one, because right now, we're solving kind of the same problems.
Yeah, I agree. Shane, did you want to go? And then I'll go.
And maybe I'll wait until we talk about John's thing. My main thing is that I feel like this recommendation, while we feel like it is a historical recommendation and we feel comfortable in that to some degree, is ultimately going to lead to people doing things their own way in a lot of different ways. I think this particular recommendation will not be followed. so
one of the reasons it's there is that if you do this for an in-cluster one, it's really bad. Like if we did this for Contour, it would have been really bad. Like because in Contour, originally in Contour, a gateway class equals a deployment. So changing the gateway class means that you deprovision the existing proxies and then reprovision them. And so that means that there is an outage involved in changing it, right? And so like it depends on exactly what's happening. I understand that in the case of like service providers, it might not necessarily be the case that there is an outage. That's why it's a recommendation and not a requirement. That hey, it's like, hey, be careful, and tend to use this as a template is probably a better idea because changing these things might mean that you're reprovisioning an entire data plane.
Yeah, I'd echo the same thing, that it's possible from cloud provider perspective too, that there could be a change at that level that could require reprovisioning infrastructure, which would also be really painful. And I think that's really the thing that we're trying to avoid, is any kind of change triggered at gateway class level that results in everything below that being reprovisioned and downtime as a result. I would also echo what Nick kind of alluded to there. This is a recommendation, not a requirement. Maybe need some more guidance here.
I think we absolutely need more guidance here about why it's a recommendation and not a requirement. Yeah. So I think that one of the things that came up in what you were saying, Keith, is about addresses particularly. I think that one of the things that we haven't done a good job of is specifying like how the addresses field on Gateway is intended to be used. The addresses field on Gateway is intended to be used like it's a request, right? It's a spec item, it's a request. But like for the case where you've got like a gateway is may claim an address from a pool of addresses. The idea is that you can, if there's a way for you to tell somebody what the pool of addresses is, then you can put that address in spec addresses, and then that address, and then status addresses tells you if that was successful or not. And so the idea here is if you have a pool of addresses, like say, if there's some way that you can configure a pool of addresses, or I mean, one thing that we could possibly do there is add some space in gateway class status to be able to bubble up sort of implementation specific information. Like, maybe there is a map string bit in the status where you can put, implementation specific information without it needing to be too structured. And then you can tell people what pool of IP addresses are available, or we have a struct or something like that. But if there's some way that you can expose that on the status of the gateway class, then you can request a specific IP address, and then the specific IP address gets claimed, and then and then the thing. But the intended contract of addresses in Gateway is that you may request you as a user may request a specific address. And then your status addresses will tell you if it succeeded or not. And if you don't request a specific address, that means please assign me some address, and I don't care what it is. And so with the assumption that once that address is assigned, it won't be reallocated, because then obviously you've got DNS updates and all that sort of stuff. So that specific part of what you were saying, that's how it's intended to work. So if you had a thing in params_ref that lets you specify like which subnet to pick addresses from or something like that, then it would make sense for there to be something that lets you check that is all okay, and then for the person who owns the gateway to be able to say, I want this specific address, and it to stay that specific address. I think that has a bit of play into what John is talking about with cluster local IP addresses as well.
So just to make sure that I'm clear, in the case of like cloud providers and stuff like that, the main concern is if you have a configuration that's referenced by parameters_ref, the main concern that you have is there are configurations that would require an entire reprovisioning of a load balancer, what have you, right?
Yeah, that's not, that's not just for cloud providers, right? That's for...
Right, it's not just for cloud providers. I'm just focusing on that for the purposes of making sure I'm talking through this correctly. So historically, when you don't want something to change, don't you usually use immutable fields? Would it be better to suggest, like, is it feasible to suggest, so that everybody's kind of on the same page, the parameters_ref isn't necessarily a template, but instead, if you make a parameters_ref and you have these kinds of problems, use immutable fields so that they're not changed on you and then reprovisioning underlying infrastructure? Or is that not feasible?
there's not a standard way to do that. There has been some discussion about it, but it's surprisingly hard to define what immutable means. Does it mean going from nil to some value? There were all kinds of things. I talked with someone in API machinery about this because we wanted it somewhere else in Gateway API. You could certainly do it with a webhook. There's not a way to do it with CRD validation, and obviously a webhook can be bypassed. Whatever. It's so
Yeah.
like all these things, they're guidelines. They're trying to avoid pain. It is ultimately up to any individual implementation, and I think in this case we just need to do a better job at describing the risks and benefits associated. But certainly, I think a high-level guideline would be if there's something that can change that's going to require things to be recreated and potentially downtime along with that, you probably don't want to propagate that down.
Yeah, makes sense. I mean, I was riffing on potentially like an alternative, but my main concern that I want to come back to is, and we are running short on time, so I should probably shush, but my main concern that I want to come back to is I see this ambiguity as a place where we will then be like, have so many different ways of doing this. And our job is to try to find the best way possible to do this, like for every implementation. I don't feel like we're there, but we should probably start time boxing this, but go ahead, Jack. Probably should
I think
keep it
David's
to the
first.
next few
I
minutes.
think Dave had his hand up first. If you want
Go
to
ahead,
first.
Dave.
The one comment I have is if you're putting the onus, or if you're making these gateway classes immutable, then you're kind of putting the onus on users to do this migration to a new gateway that uses a different class, and that will be hard, I can imagine. So I don't know what the right thing is though. I just figured it was mentioning that.
Yeah, the item that we wanted to add as well, and I think Keith had mentioned this in the chat as well, is what about options around specifying some of these changes at a gateway object? Can that be done through use of even annotations?
No
Is there
annotations.
any
No. Sorry.
or possibility of params ref even down to gateway object? And the reason that we ask is public IP, I think, or IP address in general is just one example of different configuration parameters that may be required, right? So if we have more than one item that may change, it doesn't necessarily change the underlying infrastructure as a whole per se, but maybe just a component of it. How do we kind of group all of these changes together?
I think that is the hard question. Yes.
Yeah, that is the
100%
question.
right.
Do we
Yeah.
have an action for today for this one? Do we have some sort of follow-up that we can specifically do to continue
So
this?
I think the main action is that we need to clarify this, that currently the recommendation is that you treat gateway class plus any associated parameters ref as a template, and that that is the current recommendation. To be honest, I can probably see an argument that what we are saying would be easier to explain if we just made the gateway class object immutable. You create it, that's it. After that, you can't edit it. You want to make a new one? Make a new one. You want to change it? Make a new one. You want to have a different one? Make a new one. You want to point it to a different parameters ref? Make a new one. If you want something to be more flexible than that, put it in parameters ref. I think there is an argument to be made that that might indicate what we're talking about much more cleanly. It does mean, as Dave says, because there's no mechanism to have a gateway point to two gateway classes like there is for HTTP route to gateways, that makes the migration process much more problematic for users. It means that in order to migrate each, if you have 10,000 gateways and they are all pointing to one gateway class, now you have 10,000 modifications to gateways that you need to move them to a new gateway class. Is that a problem? I mean, moving a gateway class is a pretty significant operation. It feels like something that you might want to require a conscious action, but I don't know. I probably need to think about that more. But I think the action item is definitely we should clarify what we currently have, and then possibly think some more about it. I think that we also should move on to John's theme because I suspect that what John has to say may influence this discussion.
Sounds good. Does anybody particularly want to jump in and try to do some cleanup on the documentation we have for this so far?
Sorry, and Jack, I should apologize. I'm sorry to interrupt you before about annotations. It is a bit of a running joke that I hate annotations. A large part of the reason why we're building this thing is so that we don't end up with annotations and labels, which are like unstructured data being useful in any way, like being important to the API. So yeah, I'm sorry. I was trying to be funny about it, but yeah, I was a bit rude, so I apologize.
No worries.
Okay, we're kind of getting to the half hour here, and we got a couple things left, so we might as well switch over. But I'll take on, unless somebody wants to jump in and grab this from me, the act of like trying to improve the recommendation so far, and we will continue the conversation, I think, generally speaking, in the Slack thread, but also probably we can put something on the agenda for next week if we have some more things to bring up. We'll switch to John's GEP, which is in draft, in cluster gateway deployments. Go ahead and take it away.
Yeah, if you wouldn't mind going to the actual content would be good. So basically, I've noticed that there's been a lot of discussion around kind of how we do a lot of various configurations for things like merging with gateways, whether it's, you know, the cluster local gateway or external, and all these different problems, as well as just how we manage and operate in cluster deployments and all the parameter ref stuff that we just talked about. So kind of my goal was to make one GEP that kind of covers, here's how in-cluster gateway deployments should work. And when I say in-cluster, I mean something that is actuated by, for example, a service and deployment in the cluster. It technically doesn't need to use those, but commonly does. And it's, you know, differs from kind of a cloud load balancer or something that's doing something external to the cluster. So that's the goal. It's a pretty lofty goal. And a large part of this GEP in its current form was to get us to start talking about these things and kind of figuring out what various options are. So I did fill in kind of ideas for a bunch of things, but this is in no means meant to be like, here's the doc, approve it, or I'm gonna like fight against it and like this is the way I absolutely think it must be. It's really meant to be as a starting point for discussion. So a lot of these things I don't even necessarily strongly feel about them. I just wanted to get at least something down in all the sections so that we had a starting point at least. So that's kind of the idea. I can go through it, or I don't know how much time we want to allocate to this in preferences. And kind of walk through the.
We don't have a huge, like we only have a couple things left on the agenda, so I think if you can have a fairly brief overview, I think that'd be fine.
All right, then let's see. I think there's a few kind of points here. So the first is kind of defining a common experience for in-cluster deployments. So for kind of cloud load balancers, I think there's I mean, we just saw in the last discussion, maybe this is not quite the case, but there's at least a path towards a consistent experience, right? You just create like a gateway like this one here at the bottom, and eventually some address gets populated in the status and you're good to go. Like you don't really have to do anything else. For in-cluster deployments is quite a bit different. I think everyone has a different way of saying, here's how you associate that gateway with a deployment, right? Some folks are doing kind of a more manual approach where you kind of go provision the deployment and service, and then you link them up to the gateway somehow. Some people are automating it, but you have to do XYZ config. And so it's not really like they, you know, just create a gateway and check this at the status to see how to access it experience that cloud load balancers have. So kind of part one of this is defining how do we represent those, right? There's kind of, in my mind, there's two different classes of these, whereas one is the fully automated. You create a gateway and the implementation acts as a bit of a controller or operator, whatever you want to call it, that then goes and spawns a deployment service, whatever the implementation needs. And the other is kind of a manual one where the user does that and they just link those two up together. So here's an example of like manual. this is one of those areas where I definitely feel it's pretty weak. So folks that are implementing this as well, definitely comments welcome. The next topic I tried to cover was about merging gateways. That is, again, a pretty weak point, but it's caused a lot of friction. And then finally, after that, we go into what was just talked about with Keith, which is kind of this customization, which could be anything from like the type of service. There was a whole gap about that of cluster local services. It could be the IP address assigned to that service, things like labels, annotations, or literally any field in deployment or service or whatever is created. In my experience, anytime you're deploying something in the cluster, people are going to have rules about what they can deploy in their cluster from security policies or whatever. So they will tend to want to configure all the fields. Not all of them at once, obviously, but different users will want all the different fields. And there's 1,000 fields in pod. So the API service is potentially very, very large. And potentially all those may want to be configured. So I think that covers kind of the general areas that we're trying to go into. I'm happy to go in more discussion, but I don't want to take up all the time. And so if there's questions now, we can discuss them, and would definitely appreciate folks reviewing the actual GEP.
Yeah, I haven't reviewed this just yet because it was in draft and I tend to wait on those, but I will get to this and I'll put my questions in there. Thank you for making it. Go ahead, Nick.
Wrong button. I hadn't had a chance to have a good read of this yet. Just having a quick read now. I like a lot of it. I think, in particular, I think it's clever to use the addresses field to handle some of these things. Although a specific new address type, I think, would be better rather than overloading named address. I think it's very clever that we could use the address field as a way to pick things like merging gateways or if there's pre-provisioned infrastructure. I think for customizations, one thing I'm pretty anti. I mean, I know I made a joke about it before that I hate annotations, but like I really, really dislike the idea of copying annotations from one object to another. That's a bad API smell to me. Like those things should be somewhere in a structured field somewhere, rather than just on an object. And so, yeah, I had always anticipated that for specifying annotations and stuff like that, that stuff would be done like to some extent at the gateway class level. And, like you say, like this gateway class is for cluster IPs, this one is for service type load balancer, and then that propagates down to any gateways that are created there. So yeah, but so like I will have to do a proper review and put my thoughts on there as well. But yeah, I think in terms of like very brief feedback, that's my thing. I think I really like the idea of having some way to handle the automated versus manual. I hadn't been able to think of a way to do that. I think using address is a neat way to do that. Go, Rob.
Yeah, great comments. And I would just add, this is great. Thank you, John. I added some comments already. One concern, or just, I guess, warning, is that this gap is very broad and it covers some areas that have historically been contentious. So it may be easiest if we can cut some areas out for separate gaps. Like the one that I would highlight is gateway merging is one that is just historically very complicated to reach a resolution on. So if there's some things that are kind of just on the edge of this gap, maybe they can be pushed out over to another gap. But these are absolutely issues we need to resolve, and I appreciate the initiative to just get something out there.
Okay. It's number pull request 1757 for anybody who wants to jump in there. Thank you, John. Anybody else have any last minute things, or should we move on? All right, let's talk about, Rob, go ahead and talk about the Gateway API contribution letter.
Yeah, this is one that we've talked about in previous meetings for a while, and finally got a rough doc together that's ready for some review. I don't think anything's going to be particularly surprising in here, but at a high level, what we want to communicate is we have lots of room for people to contribute. We've already had some great contributors. Thank you for everyone, people that have been contributing, adding so many new conformance tests, reviewing so many PRs, gaps, etc. Just there's been a lot of great participation. Right now, I'd say a lot of the bottleneck has been on maintainers waiting for us to review, approve, whatever, and we're hoping to get more people involved that can also help with that load. And we already have lots of people that have been doing great work, and we just want to create those kind of formal roles and define where they fit. So the scope of this doc is really about the 3 projects, Gateway API, of course, the main one, but also Ingress to Gateway, and soon to be Blixt once it completes the migration. And then, the things that I'm proposing here, again, the open to comments, but what I'm proposing here are the same kind of roles, the same kind of guidelines that upstream Kubernetes uses, the member, reviewer, approver, and then finally the sub-project owners. So member, many of you may already be members, but you can refer to the linked documentation here for what it takes to become a member, a reviewer, and approver. I'd like to highlight especially the reviewer and approver levels. We have sub-projects, well, it's basically areas within our project, including conformance, documentation, and gaps, that we have lots of people that have been very good at reviewing these areas. I think it'd be really helpful to formally specify reviewers that get automatically assigned these PRs to take them on. Some of you may already know who you are. If you're interested in this, please reach out. We would absolutely love the help, and we'd love to formally recognize all the work that people have already been doing in this project. So yeah, reviewer and approver roles, and then all of this is we want to have a good, healthy ecosystem so that we have, if any maintainer ever needs to step down, there's a very clear set of people that are eligible to replace that maintainer role, and similar with Gamma leads. So I don't think there's anything too controversial in here, but certainly we'll leave this open for comments for a while. And then depending on what kind of comments we get, we can try and get this into a GEP maybe sometime next week. But certainly before then, if you are thinking about, trying to take on a more formal role, this is your invitation. There are lots and lots of opportunities in this project. Yeah, and maybe I'll hand it off if any, Nick, Shane, if you have anything to add there.
No, yeah, I agree. I'm looking forward to having something like this. I'm hoping that it's not too controversial.
Yep, looks good. Thank you. Please do add your comments if you have them. We definitely want to hear from people who are interested in getting a more formal role. So just reach out to us. All righty, don't see any raised hands. Arc ODG wants to talk about clarify semantics when port redirect is unset.
Yeah, so the reason I'm bringing this up is after bumping to version 061 and running all the port redirect tests, I think we as in Envoy Gateway as well as Contour realized that some tests within the redirect suite don't pass, and these are the tests specifically where the port redirect is a value is unset. The conformance test checks for the port to be specified in the location header. And so I started digging in, started looking at what the API says, and the API says, hey, when the port redirect is empty, the port, if specified in the of the request, is used. So the first thing is, if specified, that tends to sort of mean that this could be some value in the host header, because that's where a port may or may not be specified. I think Shane, you, Rob, and John have mentioned that you prefer the value. So when port redirect value is empty, you expect the location header to have the L4 port or the listener port be specified or appended to the host name within the location header. So that's one of what we could do. The third is I haven't seen I played around with htbin.org. I haven't seen them sort of append the port number to the location header when so I think yeah, I was just hoping that everybody sort of reviews this and just shares more feedback on what the default semantics should be. I think this is blocking us from us being in Envoy Gateway being conformant. So yeah.
I think that in my mind, there is an important caveat to all of this, that there is an implied port in the case. Port unspecified does imply a port when based on protocol. So for HTTP, port unspecified implies 80. For HTTPS, port unspecified implies 443. And so I think I'm supportive of it being whatever's on the listener, because the listener address is supposed to be whatever the listener port is supposed to be the port that a client should connect to on the IP address that the listener says, in order to get to that thing with the host headers set as is specified. But I think that is with the caveat that if it's 80 or 4, if the listener port is 80 or 443, then it should be unspecified. I see what you're saying, Arco, that if the request is, if the request is port 10,000 and the listener port is 8,000, then why would you pick the 10,000 when that's already what's come in the request? And I think that is a good question, but I feel like it's more implementable to be able to derive that information from what's in the Kubernetes things.
So thanks for sharing that, Nick. And so just follow on to that. So you're saying that, hey, if it's 80 or 443, don't append the port to the location header. If it's not, then actually explicitly append the listener port to the location header. If port redirect is unspecified, value is unspecified. Is that right?
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. Yes.
Awesome. Thanks. Yeah.
Yeah, and I just wanted to, I think I've already commented this, and I was really just agreeing with John, but I also prefer using listener port as the reference here, as much as I admit that is certainly not what anyone would imply by reading the spec right now. The spec is fairly vague. The listener port is something that I prefer just because it is something that is statically configurable. So, you can compute that just in the controller code itself. You don't have to worry about underlying implementation details. It allows us to be consistent across implementations. I feel like that may be challenging for any other thing, any other
Agree
option.
with that. My sentiment as well. I think that you do this, rather you do what was being recommended or asked for a couple of times here, and you get a situation that like every control plane is responsible for it, and that makes it very easy to implement. Once you push it down to where it might be something that the data plane has to kind of reason with, you might get different behaviors, but it would be better to compile it at that higher level, I think. But again, we are asking you to kind of veer hard off the road. So thanks for rolling with it a little bit. You don't by any stretch of the imagination need to like balloon this PR into something huge. We can codify our intent as an issue and follow up.
Ajay?
Yeah, I guess maybe I haven't read, I don't remember exactly what the comments were on this, but when we say if specified, what do we mean here? Do we mean the L4 address that the client was connecting to specified a port, or the authority or host header specified a port?
This is specific to the port in a redirect filter. So it's when specified in the gateway in the HTTP route API. So when port in redirect filter with an
Oh yeah,
HTTP
yeah,
route
no,
is
totally. But
unspecified.
when the port that you redirect, so if you don't say to rewrite the port with the filter, and you're say only rewriting a path,
Mhm.
with a redirect status code as well, where does the port that you specify on the location, the turned location header come from, right? Like, is it the L4 port that the client connected to, or is it, say the request was made with host name, with host header, wikipedia.org:8080, right? And the actual listener port was something else, or the listener port was, I don't know.
To be honest, the more I
Right.
think about it,
You can have those things kind of be not exactly the same, right?
the more I think about it, the more I feel like we're overcomplicating this, and it should be, if you want to port, if you're redirecting here, right? Like this is not actually about the port that you connected to. This is about where you are redirecting to.
The
So,
spec
like,
the spec kind of implies that the port is specified when it comes on the request that the client is making, right? But it totally makes sense that if the redirect set, like what Nick is saying, if you want to redirect and you want to change the port that the location header has in it, then you should specify that. But I think the contention here is that the tests make a request on whatever IP address of the gateway and listener port, and then they expect that the location header has host name that the gateway is applied to, listener port in the location header, which, I mean, does that, I guess it
So-
makes sense in some way, but that's not what that's not what was in the authority header of the request. That was in the TCP connection details of the request, right?
but the idea here is that the listener on the gateway defines the thing that the client should be connecting to, right? Like, so the listener tells you, like, the point of the listener is to define the thing that it should be connecting to. So that's so here, yeah. So here you're redirecting something. So this is obviously, so there's a couple of rules. First, if you do specify a port, then in the redirect, then that overrides everything we're talking about, right? Just to be clear. If you do specify a port in the redirect and it's 80 or 443, or so whichever way the port ends up being decided, if the final port is 80 or 443, then you should not specify a port, because that is implied by the protocol. If you don't specify a port in the redirect, and there is a non-80 or 443 port on as the listener port, then the client has expected to connect to some hostname : port, because some hostname is whatever IP address the listener is, and then you've had to connect to some non-default port, so that will be in the URL, that will be in the client header. So if that's why that is then the canonical value for what the listener port for the redirect should be, because that's what you connected to, right? And so if you want to override that behavior and want to have it be a different port, then you need to specify a port. But like we're skipping one layer. The reason we don't want to do it by looking at what's in the actual authority is because then that places dependency on the fact that your data path can read the authority and and take actions based on it. I mean, which most of them can, but like maybe they can't. And whereas that information is present already in the API in the listener port, in that you must, it is implied that if you are connecting to a listener and it's on a non-default port, then you're putting that into the authority header.
Yeah, so I think in that case, the tests need to change if we want a special case port 80 and 443, right? I think
Yes,
how works right now. As the tests work right now, the tests make a request, and it always expects the port is set on the location header. So we kind of need to actually change the test and also add a new test. Have a gateway listener on a non-standard port, and then also have a gateway listener on a standard port, and make sure that the right things are set up.
Yeah. I should say I would whoever makes that change should just 100% check that that's what the RFC for redirects says. You like whether the RFC for redirects makes a recommendation there. I can't remember if the RFC for redirects says you must always include a port. If that is the case, then I'm wrong, and you must always include a port. But to my understanding, if the port is 80 or 443, then and you like doing HTTP or HTTPS respectively, then you don't, then including the port is optional. But I could be wrong. So that part I might be wrong about.
Yeah, I think I'm probably confusing the Gateway API documentation with the RFC now, but I feel like there was either nothing said about it or it said something about if specified again, which, yeah. So
I guess the action item here is that we need to, I 100% agree with you, the tests and the language and the spec need to be clarified. It should be made clear, for the three cases that you need to handle here are port specified in the redirect, then it doesn't matter. When there's no port specified and the port in the listener is 80 or 443. And then when there's no port specified and the port is not 80 or 443. Actually, and the last one is port specified in the redirect and it's 80 or 443. I can type that, Shane. It's fine.
Okay. Somebody want to take that action item of cleaning that up a little bit?
Yeah, I can do it, Shane. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Awesome. Thank you for the clarifications. I'll make the changes in the API as well as in the tests.
Thank you. Thank you for your persistence. I kind of stepped into a weird one there, so we appreciate you kind of taking it to the meeting and stuff like that and following it through.
Yeah, no problem.
Those can be a little tedious, but it's very much appreciated. All right, we got 4 minutes left, so we can try our triage item. Policy attachment. While Nick's filling that in.
Yeah. Sorry.
I added this one so I'll start talking about it while Nick's still going here. But Nick has an old PR that I took way too long to meaningfully review. Sorry. But also I want it's really good. I think there's a lot of good changes here. And since policy attachment has come back up as an issue that is overly complicated, I think Nick had some ideas here that could provide a simpler, basically policy attachment light version of this. So I really want to encourage everyone here to take some time to review this and see if it makes sense. It is a fairly large change. And with that, yeah, I can head over to you, Nick, to give any additional info about it.
Yeah, so this change, I would summarize as it does a few things. Firstly, it coins the word meta resource to talk about a meta resource that augments the functionality of another object. Policies are a meta resource. Technically, reference grant is also a meta resource, but it's not as useful a use case here. The other thing that it does is previously when we talked about policy attachment, we really only talked about the hierarchical policy attachment, where a policy would flow across a hierarchy and there would be defaults and overrides. Rob and I spent a lot of time working this out because of both of our experiences in having settings like timeouts need that sort of defaults and overrides behavior. Sanjay, I know you know how hard it was for us in Contour to sort of manage the defaults and overrides. Without something like this, in Contour, you needed 4 definitions of every single timeout that you wanted to configure. A global default, and whether or not that an override value that would override any other settings anywhere else, and then a per route default and a per route override. Like it was really complicated, and it meant that adding any singular timeout was a lot of work. So that's one of the reasons why there's the big mechanisms there about hierarchical policy attachment. However, it has come up in mesh and other cases that's pretty complicated, and a lot of the time you don't need that functionality. So the thing that this new revision adds is direct policy attachment. which attaches a policy specifically to a single object or kind of objects I've allowed in here. And that then has a couple of extra rules. It can't cross namespace boundaries. It is allowed to cross namespace boundaries, but it has significant, it sort of says don't do that unless you have a really good reason. Pretty much the only good reason at the moment is, hey, I want to do a consumer policy in a service mesh use case. But in general, you shouldn't do these across namespaces. I think is the wording. I can't remember the exact wording I put in there, but hierarchical ones will not be allowed to cross namespaces. One of the things that I have changed is that Rob made the good point that for this to work, we need a way for the policies to be consumable so that you can understand what is actually happening with them. Doing that in status is really hard because doing it in status implies that the status will be updated anytime the set of things changes, which means that you can generate a lot of API server load accidentally with fan out and fan in kind of problems. The thing that I have tried to do here is to change. One of the things I have done is we already have a policy target reference struct in the API that is the current way that you define this as a policy. That's it right there. Thanks, Shane. One of the things I have added here is a type that can be either direct or hierarchical. Hierarchical is a terrible name. I would love to come up with a better name, but it's too complicated and too hard to spell. I think I've misspelled it a couple of times in this specific document, and I've been typing it a lot. I think that there are definitely better names that we could do, but I'm using it for now because it's clear. And so the intent here is that a policy is any object that includes a top level target ref field that is this struct. That is a policy. Anything that does that is a policy. The type of policy is set by the type. And it's expected that for a hierarchical policy, you would have defaults and overrides as the other two top level fields. I still haven't clarified. There's a couple of bits in there that I sort of only realized I hadn't clarified this morning. But that's the sort of idea here, is to sort of try and dial this in so that it's more, the intent is that this means that tools having this stuff inline in a structured field rather than Rob's initial suggestion was an annotation. Aside from the fact that I hate annotations, I think that the reason I wanted to not do this with an annotation is it means that you can duck type any policy object using a structure that only has this target reference and be able to guess something about it without needing to know anything about the structure. Thanks. We are out of time. Yeah. And so that's those are the things that I've been aiming at here, is to make this a little bit easier to understand by adding the idea of direct policy attachment and making it clear that hierarchical policy attachment is different. Again, and yes, please, everyone who is interested in policy, which I think is a lot of people, I've certainly been seeing a lot of questions about policy attachment recently. This is one of the reasons why I had started doing this. But it's becoming more and more relevant because lots of people want to use policy, and I'm worried that we're going to get wildly varying things because we haven't been specific enough about the language. So please, if you are interested in using policy, please review this thing, put some comments on it, give me suggestions for the names that I can call things rather than hierarchical policy. I did consider direct and indirect, but it's a little bit misleading. Might not be clear enough. Naming is hard. So yeah, please have a look at it and tell me what you think. Probably will have some more updates today to clarify a couple of the questions that Rob has put in already.
Sounds good. And with that, we are out of time. Thank you, everybody, for coming today. Please do follow up on any of these PRs that we brought up if you're interested. Until next time.
See?
Cheers.